Across the battlefields of the ancient world, there was one sight that froze men in their tracks: the Phalanx, a living wall of iron, thousands of soldiers locked shoulder to shoulder, their spears thrust forward like the teeth of some monstrous beast. It crushed Athens, it broke the pride of Persia, and under Alexander the Great, it carved a path across continents. To face the Phalanx was to face death itself. Its power was absolute, yet also dangerously fragile. One flaw in the ground, one strike at the flank, and the machine could shatter in an instant. This is not just the story of a formation. It is the story of glory and terror, of discipline and weakness, of how the greatest weapon of its age rose to dominate the world, and how it was finally broken. The story of the Phalanx begins in ancient Greece, but it was Philip II of Macedon who transformed it into the most feared weapon of its age. Before Philip, Greek city-states had already used the hoplite phalanx, lines of citizen soldiers armed with spears and shields, standing shoulder to shoulder in rigid blocks. It was powerful, but also limited. Spears were short, formations shallow, and battles often turned into shoving matches that demanded sheer strength. Philip returned to Macedonia after years of studying warfare in Thebes. He had seen firsthand how Theban generals like Epaminondas had reshaped Greek tactics. Drawing from these lessons, he introduced something radical: the sarissa, a spear nearly twice as long as the traditional hoplite's weapon. 6 meters of ash wood tipped with iron, so long that 5 full ranks of men could project their spears beyond the first line. The Macedonian phalanx was no longer a loose wall of men. It became a forest of spears, bristling like a porcupine, advancing as a single machine. To hold the sarissa required both hands, so soldiers carried smaller shields strapped to the forearm. Their armor was lighter, making them faster to deploy. But the true strength lay in depth. The formation stretched 16 men deep, each rank pushing forward, their spears overlapping in a deadly hedge. The test came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. The combined forces of Athens and Thebes, two of the greatest powers of Greece, stood against Philip's Macedonian army. Facing them, the Phalanx advanced like an unstoppable wall. The Athenians struggled to pierce the forest of sarissas. Their shorter spears could not reach through, and each attempt to close in was met with iron tips that drove them back. On the Macedonian left, a young commander led the decisive charge. Alexander, only 18 years old, cutting through the sacred band of Thebes. It was a slaughter. Greece, the land of independent city-states, was brought under Macedonian dominance. Compared to the earlier hoplite line, Philip's phalanx was a revolution. Imagine standing with a 2-meter spear against an enemy holding a 6-meter pike. The longer reach decides who strikes first. Imagine a shallow line of 10 ranks colliding with 16. Weight, momentum, and sheer pressure crushed the weaker wall. The phalanx was not only a formation, it was a statement of discipline and unity. Every man was a cog in the machine, and the machine itself became a weapon greater than the sum of its parts. Yet the phalanx was not invincible on its own. Philip understood this. He never relied on the formation in isolation. He paired it with cavalry, the famed companion cavalry that could sweep around an enemy once the phalanx had fixed them in place. This was the genius of Macedonian warfare. The phalanx as the hammer, the cavalry as the anvil. And it was his son, Alexander the Great, who would take this strategy beyond Greece and use it to smash the mighty Persian Empire. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC, the throne of Macedon passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Few could have predicted that within a decade, this young king would carve out one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. His weapon of choice was the phalanx, perfected by his father, now wielded on an even greater stage. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Alexander faced Darius III of Persia. The Persian army dwarfed his own in numbers. Tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry from every corner of the empire, even Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, stretched across the plain. Against this tide, Alexander anchored his center with the Macedonian phalanx. Line after line of sarissas bristled forward, locking shields and advancing step by step. The Persians tried to break through with waves of cavalry, but the forest of pikes held firm. Horses refused to impale themselves on 6 meters of sharpened ash wood. Every attempt to crash into the line only ended with broken momentum and skewered riders. The phalanx did exactly what it was designed to do: pin the enemy in place, absorb the pressure, and give Alexander the opening he needed. On the right flank, Alexander personally led the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen of Macedon. As the phalanx held the Persian center, Alexander's cavalry wheeled around and drove straight at Darius himself. The sight of the young Macedonian king charging with his men was enough to break the great king's nerve. Darius fled the battlefield. The Persians collapsed. A world power had been shaken, but Issus was only the beginning. 2 years later, at the decisive Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BC, Alexander faced Darius again. This time, the Persians prepared carefully. Darius ordered the ground leveled to allow his war chariots to charge, and his army stretched across a vast plain. Once again, Alexander relied on the phalanx to anchor the line. Sarissas formed an impenetrable hedge against both cavalry and chariots. When the Persians attacked, the phalanx held, absorbing the shock. And then, as before, came the hammer blow. Alexander led his cavalry in a wedge formation, slicing into a gap in the Persian lines. The phalanx surged forward, pushing against the center, while cavalry shattered the flank. Darius fled once more, and the Persian Empire, an empire of centuries, fell in a single day. The brilliance of Alexander's strategy lay in synergy. The phalanx was the anvil, the immovable wall. The cavalry was the hammer, delivering the decisive strike. Together, they created a war machine unlike anything the world had seen. Compared with other formations of the ancient world, the Macedonian system was unmatched. Against the Persian hordes, the phalanx's discipline outclassed raw numbers. Against cavalry charges, it was stronger than the Greek hoplite shield wall. Even wedge formations or feigned retreats faltered when confronted by a disciplined block of sarissas. For a time, it seemed unstoppable. The phalanx marched from Greece to Asia Minor, from Syria to Egypt, and finally to the plains of Mesopotamia. Wherever it went, it crushed resistance and paved the way for Alexander's dream of empire. But history has a way of revealing flaws, even in the strongest of weapons. The very rigidity that gave the phalanx its power would, in time, also expose its greatest weakness. To understand why the phalanx terrified its enemies, we must look closely at its strengths. For centuries, this formation was the definition of battlefield dominance. The first and most obvious advantage was reach. A Macedonian sarissa stretched nearly 6 meters. Imagine standing with a spear just 2 meters long, facing a wall of pikes 3 times your length. The outcome was decided before blades ever crossed. 5 ranks of soldiers could strike at once, each pike protruding beyond the line in front. It meant that any enemy trying to close in was skewered long before they reached the first Macedonian shield. The second strength was cohesion. The phalanx was not just a group of men, it was a machine. 16 ranks deep, every soldier pressed forward, the rear ranks pushing the front, creating constant pressure. Shields overlapped, pikes leveled, and step by step, the formation advanced like an iron wall. Unlike looser formations, it did not break into scattered duels. It fought as one, overwhelming the enemy through sheer collective force. Then came discipline. The men of the phalanx were drilled relentlessly. They learned to move as a single body, to wheel left or right on command, to keep formation even in the chaos of battle. This discipline turned them into more than soldiers. It turned them into gears in a war machine. Against undisciplined armies, this was devastating. At Chaeronea, Athenian hoplites, brave but less coordinated, were simply ground down by the relentless advance. And there was psychology. Facing the phalanx was like staring at death itself. A forest of iron-tipped spears glinting in the sun, an endless hedge that seemed impossible to break. Horses balked before charging it. Infantry lost courage as the line drew near. Fear won battles before swords even clashed. Compared to other formations, the superiority was clear. The shield wall of Germanic tribes or Vikings centuries later offered solid defense, but it lacked the deadly reach of the sarissa. The wedge formation, favored by cavalry to pierce enemy lines, could smash through weaker troops. But against a phalanx 16 men deep, it shattered on the points of 100 spears. Even the Roman maniple system, which would one day defeat the phalanx, could not match its raw frontal power in an open plain. This is why Alexander relied on it again and again. At Issus, it pinned the Persian army, allowing his cavalry to strike. At Gaugamela, it held the line against war chariots and endless infantry. The phalanx was the anvil upon which empires broke. For a moment in history, it was as close to invincible as any battlefield formation could be. Wherever the phalanx advanced, through Asia Minor, across the Nile in Egypt, onto the plains of Mesopotamia, it crushed resistance. It was the embodiment of Macedonian power, a formation that turned ordinary men into an unstoppable force. And yet history reminds us that strength always comes with a shadow. The very qualities that made the phalanx so formidable would, in time, reveal its fatal flaws. For all its terrifying power, the phalanx carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. What made it strong also made it dangerously fragile. The first weakness was mobility. The phalanx required flat, open ground to maintain its integrity. On level plains, it was a juggernaut, but on uneven terrain, hills, broken fields, forests, it faltered. 16 ranks of men with 6-meter spears could not easily maneuver around rocks, gullies, or slopes. A single disruption in the line could ripple through the ranks, breaking the unity that gave the formation its strength. The second weakness lay in the flanks. The front of the phalanx was nearly invulnerable, but its sides and rear were exposed. A disciplined army that managed to outmaneuver the wall of spears could roll up the formation like a scroll. This vulnerability was no secret. Generals knew that the way to defeat the phalanx was not to strike its face, but to cut into its sides. The third weakness was rigidity. Soldiers in the phalanx were locked into position, both hands gripping their sarissas. This left little room for flexibility. If the battle demanded sudden changes, the phalanx responded slowly. Where Roman legionaries could shift formations, throw javelins, and fight individually with their short swords, the phalangites were bound together, strong as a block, but clumsy as individuals. History provides brutal proof of these flaws. In 197 BC, at the Battle of Cynocephalae, the Macedonian phalanx faced the Roman legions. On uneven hills, the phalanx struggled to maintain cohesion. Parts of the line advanced while others lagged behind. The Romans exploited the gaps, sending maniples to strike the flanks and rear. Once the line broke, the phalanx collapsed into chaos. An even more decisive lesson came at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. The Macedonians initially drove the Romans back with their formidable spear wall. But as the fighting moved into rougher ground, the phalanx lost its perfect alignment. Gaps opened. Roman legionaries slipped inside, closing to hand-to-hand combat where their short swords, the gladius, had the advantage. The sarissa, so deadly at a distance, was useless up close. The Macedonian phalanx disintegrated under the flexible, modular power of the legion. Compared side by side, the difference was stark. The phalanx was a sledgehammer, unstoppable when swung straight, but unwieldy if turned aside. The Roman legion was a collection of daggers, each small, maneuverable, able to cut wherever an opening appeared. One formation emphasized unity, the other flexibility. In the end, flexibility proved the greater strength. Thus, the mighty formation that had carried Alexander to the ends of the earth found itself broken on the hills of Greece by an enemy that had studied its flaws. The phalanx was no longer the weapon of the future. It had become a relic of the past. The downfall of the phalanx was not a single moment, but a series of brutal lessons written in blood. Once generals learned how to exploit its weaknesses, the formation that had once seemed unstoppable became dangerously predictable. Perhaps the most famous demonstration of how to dismantle a rigid formation came not against the Phalanx itself, but at the Battle of Chaeronea in 216 BC. There, Hannibal of Carthage faced the Roman legions. He deliberately allowed his center to bend backward while his cavalry swept around the flanks. The Romans, drawn into the trap, were encircled and destroyed. The principle was clear. When an army relies too heavily on a solid block, it risks being enveloped. And what was the Phalanx if not the ultimate solid block? Roman commanders absorbed this lesson. They realized that to defeat the Phalanx, they had to avoid its steel wall head-on. Instead, they targeted the ground it stood on, the flanks it could not defend, and the spaces between its rigid ranks. At Cynocephalae and Pydna, they perfected this method, proving that discipline combined with flexibility could shatter even the mightiest spear wall. The decisive moment came at Pydna in 168 BC. As the Macedonian phalanx advanced, it seemed once more to dominate. The long spears pushed the Romans back, and for a moment it looked as if Alexander's ghost still walked the battlefield. But then the terrain shifted. Ditches, uneven ground, and small hills broke the alignment. Gaps opened like cracks in glass. The Romans struck, maniples darting into the breaches, soldiers hacking at the unprotected sides with their short swords. The Phalanx, mighty in its front, was powerless once its order was broken. What followed was slaughter. The Roman legions annihilated the Macedonian army, and with it, the dream of the Phalanx as the supreme instrument of war. From that point forward, the Roman legion became the gold standard of ancient warfare. Where the Phalanx was rigid, the legion was flexible. Where the Phalanx required perfect ground, the legion adapted to hills, forests, or fields. Where the Phalanx relied on mass and pressure, the legion thrived on maneuver and initiative. The two were more than formations. They were philosophies. One valued unity above all, the other valued adaptability. The lesson was eternal. No matter how terrifying a formation may seem, once its pattern is known, enemies will find a way to break it. The Phalanx had once crushed Athens and Persia, but now it crumbled before Rome. In the contest of empires, its time had passed. The Phalanx did not vanish in a single day. Even after its defeat at Pydna, it continued to be used by successor kingdoms. Generals across the Hellenistic world, from the Seleucids in the east to the Ptolemies in Egypt, still trusted in the wall of spears. Yet each time it met the Roman legions, the outcome grew more predictable. The weapon that had once conquered empires was slowly fading into history, and yet its legacy endured. Centuries later, medieval armies in Europe would revive the concept in their pike squares. Swiss mercenaries in the 15th century, bristling with long pikes, terrified knights in armor just as the Macedonian Phalanx had terrified Persian cavalry. Even in the Renaissance, Spanish tercios, formations of pikemen mixed with musketeers, echoed the discipline and unity of Philip's original creation. More than just a military formation, the Phalanx embodied a philosophy. It was the belief that unity and discipline could overcome chaos and fear. It turned farmers into warriors, and warriors into conquerors. It gave Alexander the Great the foundation upon which to build an empire, stretching from Greece to India. And its downfall carried its own lesson. Strength without flexibility becomes weakness. Power without adaptability becomes fragility. The Roman legions showed that victory did not always belong to the heaviest hammer, but to the sharpest mind. Today, when historians look back at the clash between the Phalanx and the legion, they see more than two formations. They see two visions of warfare and two ways of life. One rigid, one adaptable. One brilliant for its time, the other timeless. The Phalanx may have fallen on the hills of Pydna, but it remains immortal in memory. It stands as both a symbol of glory and a cautionary tale, that no wall, however strong, lasts forever.